So around 2 years ago, I released a video on the channel detailing the incredible rise and tragic downfall of the Internet Explorer browser, afterwards thinking that it was the end of the story for it. But now it's come to my attention that 2 years later, Microsoft has planned on, or has by the time this video releases, retired it for good, officially marking the end of a fascinating 27 years of both high and low points. In retrospect, looking back at that video, I feel as though it hasn't aged quite as well as I'd have liked it to, and feel like I could do a better job of telling that story. So with that being said, let's dive right in.
Tonight, the information superhighway and one of its main thoroughfares, an online network called Internet.
The Internet, a global hookup that permits computers to exchange information.
5 years from now, we're not going to have distinct cable and telephone industries.
Where people order movies on demand instead of driving to the local video store.
The first thing you need to understand is that the internet of the mid-90s was primarily dominated by a little-known browser called Netscape Navigator, released in 1994. It held tremendous power over the internet with just over a 90% market share at its peak. I can't emphasize this enough, using the World Wide Web back then was literally coined as using Netscape. And while yes, I'm aware of the fact that Netscape was not the first ever web browser, others which coexisted in the small ecosystem of that time are just not relevant to this story. Fortunately, or should I say unfortunately for Netscape, a little-known company whose name you might have heard of, Microsoft, wanted a piece of the action. So in 1995, alongside Windows 95, they released a web browser of their own, Internet Explorer. However, Microsoft wasn't going to be satisfied with just competing with Netscape, no. They were going for the crown directly, and nothing was going to stop them. A browser war would ensue for the next few years as both of these companies eyed for dominance of the internet, and it's here where Microsoft had the upper hand. In 1997, they flexed a bold strategy by making the evolved Internet Explorer 4 completely free for consumers, while Netscape's 3.0 version of Navigator released the following year would charge around $50 for access. This was the point in which a shift was beginning to be noticed. Microsoft's strategy had seemingly paid off as more and more consumers were now seen flocking to their side. I mean, just look at the data. By 1998, Netscape's once legendary market share had fallen to just a measly 8%, contrasted to that of Explorer's now 90% dominance of the internet. It only took 4 years, but Microsoft now had the world's most used web browser. The war was over, and Microsoft had won. But as our story goes, not for very long. The 2000s not only meant a new state of expectations for web browsers in the security sector, but also presented a whole new set of challenges. You see, company sites like Amazon and eBay were looking towards shoppers taking their business online, and that meant people had to entrust sensitive personal information with their browser. With this context in mind, let's return to Internet Explorer, who would enjoy its peak 95% market share for just a few years before two simultaneous threats challenged it. The first was due in part to it being the biggest web browser. Hackers and crooks had painted a massive target on Explorer's back, attempting to create exploits to steal said personal information. And sadly, it was working. This would have seemed like a golden opportunity for Microsoft to respond, quickly patch things up browser side, and hopefully restore any lost consumer confidence, right? Unfortunately, this was far from the case. One may argue that Microsoft instead dropped the ball pretty hard here, especially with the release of Explorer 6 in 2001. Just what was up with Microsoft? Well, there's no way to know for sure, but to me it seemed like a classic case of letting one's guard down. As they had by this point achieved near total market dominance without any competition in sight, they simply stopped trying as hard as they once did to initially obtain it, and that's where you get a slow, buggy, and vulnerable mess like Explorer 6, as well as a 5-year gap between that and Explorer 7. Microsoft's negligence and incompetence in this case had unintentionally yet severely wounded their browser's reputation, and it also created a slow but steady bleeding of users which would never heal. For Explorer, this was the beginning of the end. However, things were only about to get worse for them. Remember when I said how Microsoft had literally zero competition in the browser sphere? Yeah, well, that was about to change because much like what Explorer originally did to Netscape in the 90s, it would come back to bite them. And in a devastating way. This brings us to our second threat, which challenged Explorer's dominance, because the early to late 2000s saw the rise of other web browsers such as Safari, Chrome, and even Mozilla's Firefox, which ironically was built from the ashes of Netscape's source code. This trio would strike at pieces of Explorer's popularity throughout the years in what was essentially a second browser war, with each one taking a chunk of its market share with them. Talk about sweet revenge. And with that, we come to what I originally thought was the end of the story for Internet Explorer. Relegated to an empty, rotting husk of what used to be the browser that had near complete control over users' access to the internet, the final version of it releasing in 2013, followed by a less than stellar launch of Microsoft Edge in 2015, once thought to have been the hopeful successor but ended up being unable to retain the popularity that Explorer had and just faded away quietly, etc, etc, etc. However, I recently learned that Microsoft was planning on retiring the Explorer browser for good as of June 15, 2022. This made it all the more clear that the company believed it was time to move on. And I'd have to agree. Don't get me wrong, Explorer had its charm in the early days, plus the decision that Microsoft took in 1997 making it free to consumers was a great step in signaling that people's gateway to browsing the web shouldn't come at a cost. That mindset was rewarded because for most people Explorer was their first and only choice. But the times have since changed and events have happened which leads to us now witnessing the end of an era. Hopefully, for Microsoft's sake, lessons were learned after all of this and they can use that knowledge in their future endeavors. With that being said, all I have left to say is, goodbye Internet Explorer. Thanks for the memories.